Thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and I hope this will be a great panel for you. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Ben Heath. I'll be moderating this event. I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Economic Law Interest Group here at the American Society of International Law, and while folks are still sort of coming in, one of the things that we do for our members is we've been doing for the past few years since the pandemic an online book talk series. And we thought for this particular talk that it would be even sort of more generative, more exciting for our members if we could get authors who are working on books or have recently completed books on the same theme to come together and discuss all together and sort of have a more dynamic roundtable discussion. And so that's what we've done. And the theme that we've picked here is sanctions and economic statecraft. And there's kind of an avalanche of books coming out, and we've picked 4 of the most exciting and most outstanding authors in the field to talk to you from a wide range of perspectives, wide range of disciplines. And so we're just going to dive into it. And so with me here, I'm just going to go clockwise in the order I see them on my screen. We have Mona Ali, who is writing a book about the politics of the global dollar system. We have Nicholas Mulder, whose book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, was published last year by Yale University Press. Christine Abely, whose book, The Russia Sanctions, is going to be published by Cambridge University Press next February. And Daniel McDowell, whose book, Bucking the Buck, U.S. Financial Sanctions and the International Backlash Against the Dollar, was published this year by Oxford University Press. And so what I want to do now is, I'm going to sort of have I'm going to have a few questions prepared. I'm going to invite different panelists to come in and talk. We're going to run it a little bit more like a roundtable, and so we're going to have a sort of a loose discussion. The plan I have is that we'll talk for about an hour, and then we have about 30 minutes left for Q&A, give or take some time, and I will try to keep folks. Keep things moving. So with no further ado, Christine, why don't you set the stage for us and kind of explain the current state of play? So, in 2022, the coordinated sanctions against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine was considered to be kind of a watershed moment, some kind of momentous point for sanctions, maybe even a turning point for the international order. And I guess the question is why? What did the allied countries do that was so different or so momentous? And what should we expect to see, going forward in this respect?
Certainly. As you mentioned, one major aspect of the 2022 sanctions was the fact that they were coordinated amongst so many jurisdictions and nations. So the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and a whole host of other countries joined together to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So previously, certainly there had been sanctions imposed against Russia, but these had been much more targeted in nature, designed to address specific bad actors, individuals, entities, cyber criminals, for example. There had been comprehensive sanctions in place, but just with respect to the Crimea region of Ukraine after the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. So the sanctions imposed against Russia in 2022 technically were not comprehensive as the sanctions against Iran or North Korea are, but they are they're so numerous that they almost do represent a comprehensive sanctions regime. And in addition to the sheer number of targets that were sanctioned, the US, for example, in the first year of imposing sanctions, targeted 2,500 Russian related entities and individuals and added them to the specially designated nationals and block persons list. But in addition to just the sheer number of targets that were sanctioned was also the importance and to the Russian economy of the particular entities and sectors that were sanctioned. For example, the energy sanctions were very significant. the sanctions against Russian financial institutions were also very significant as well. So this was really an occasion on which the coalition of nations joined together to enact a sweeping sanctions regime against Russia in response to this invasion of Ukraine. So that's really what's significant about this these rounds of sanctions starting in 2022. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't.
I'm muted. Old school is a mistake. One of the kind of main drivers behind sanctions, at least in the discourse in the United States, right, has been that sanctions are an alternative to us joining the war effort in Ukraine, right? It's a more peaceful option. It keeps us out of war. And so, Nicholas, I kind of want to bring you in here because one of the main threads in your book is the harm that sanctions cause. And in your history of sanctions in the early 20th century, you point out that that many of the kind of norm entrepreneurs who pushed sanctions understood them less as a peaceful alternative and more as a potentially devastating and incredibly dangerous tool that was going to be so overwhelming, so powerful that that maybe we wouldn't even have to use them. Simply the threat would keep actors in line. And so, I mean, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how we got from there to this point where sanctions have become this kind of permanent and often unseen feature of global governance.
Sure, yes. So we're in an interesting moment, actually, because the purpose of sanctions against Russia is actually one of the most classic ones, which is the defense of territorial integrity and international law. And that is how they originated, at least in a modern international multilateral sense, with the League of Nations in 1919 and in the interwar period. And their inspiration came from the use of blockade in World War I, but it was adapted for peacetime use. And I think what makes the current period interesting, but also a bit confusing, is that, like I said, it's a bit of a blast from the past. We actually just haven't seen that many wars of aggression of this kind that have prompted the use of sanctions. But we have, of course, throughout the Cold War, seen a steady increase, particularly from the 1990s onwards. And I would say that there is actually an important qualitative shift also around World War II, because the interwar sanctions apparatus of the League of Nations was purely focused on preventing wars of aggression and conflict between sovereign states. It did not care about the internal politics of countries involved. And there was a good reason for that, because many of the European states in the League were themselves empires. So they were hardly in a position to criticize other countries for their governance norms. But after World War II, the United Nations has a slightly different way of operating. And I think on top of that, the Cold War, right, and ideological confrontation, the rise of human rights treaties, a lot of these other norms, that's, I think, what people refer to when they talk about the liberal international order. But the interwar period, despite having a bunch of countries that were self-described liberal countries in it, wasn't liberal in that sense. It didn't care about domestic politics. In the Cold War, of course, there have been sanctions that were imposed because of the domestic nature of regimes. I mean, I'm thinking just about Cuba, North Korea, right? These very long-standing embargoes. And then more recently, non-proliferation, political prisoners, all these sorts of things. So very much internal actions of countries that do not involve interstate warfare. But as a result, that's what makes the current situation, I think, a bit confusing, because we have this hangover of many sanctions regimes that had internal goals, and then we now have a major multinational regime against Russia for a very classic interstate war.
Great. That's a good point to bring Dan in here, because with the Russia sanctions, as Christine mentioned, right, we're adding individuals and firms to something called the specially designated nationals list, right, or the blocked persons list. And so we're using these techniques that we've developed over the course of the 20th and 21st century to deal with things like human rights violators and other sort of, even hackers or transnational criminal organizations. And now we're applying them to Russia. So Dan, I'm wondering if you can sort of explain at a basic level how financial sanctions today are working for those of our audience who are maybe not so familiar. how do they work, and how do they take advantage, particularly of the dominance of the U.S. dollar in the international financial system?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So I would start out by sort of separating sanctions, financial sanctions, into two categories. On the one hand, we've got sanctions that cut off an actor's access to its wealth, so asset freezes. And on the other, there are sanctions that prevent an actor from participating in cross-border transactions, so really blocking an individual or entity from making or receiving payment. I'm going to start with the second part first, because it's a bit more technical. International payments, I think it's important to start out with understanding that they're really the lifeblood of the world economy, right? Anytime an individual or a business, any entity services a foreign debt or invests in a foreign asset, a cross-border payment is made. Even world trade, which might be surprising to some, is highly dependent on cross-border payments. Something like 90% of commercial exchanges worldwide depend on banks to provide trade finance. And so you've got to have cross-border payments in the financial system sort of at sort of some step in that process. Payment systems really rely on three fundamental components. The first is the medium of exchange, or the currency in which entities wish to make or receive payment. The second is the pipes through which the currency or payments flow. Those are correspondent bank accounts. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally, a communication network, which is SWIFT. So first, with currency choice, the dollar is the world's most widely used cross-border payment currency. Based on most recent data, about half of all cross-border payments are made in dollars today. The euro is in second place at around 20%, with all the other currencies in the world making up that remaining 30%. If we just focus on trade, the dollar is something like 85% share of trade finance worldwide. So the point is, if you're transacting across borders, chances are you're using dollars. That's how critical the dollar is to the functioning of cross-border exchange. Now, if we talk about the pipes, okay, that's the correspondent banking account. So how do these dollars move around the world? If I'm a business in Argentina and I want to import goods from a company in Kansas, I agree to make payment in dollars, but the problem is my bank doesn't have an account with the exporter's bank in Kansas. So how will that work? The same way we think about moving around the United States through airports. If I want to fly from Syracuse to Toledo, Ohio, I'm not going to get a direct flight. I'm going to connect in a major hub. That's basically how banking works. And so essentially that bank in Argentina has an account with JP Morgan. The bank in Kansas has an account with JP Morgan. And so that sort of shared account at JP Morgan allows the banks to sort of route the dollars through that one correspondent account. And there are less than 50 major global banks that are part of something called CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System. That's really the core of the cross-border dollar payment system. And those less than 50 banks really act as the intermediaries and more than 95% of all dollar transactions worldwide on a daily basis. So you've got to have access to those banks, essentially, if you want to be involved in cross-border dollar payments. And all those banks, we'll come back to this in a moment, are subject to US law. Lastly, there's communication. That's SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, based in Belgium. Less important for this discussion, I think, right now, but that's how the bank in Argentina tells JP Morgan it wants to move dollars from its client account to the beneficiary's account in Kansas. It doesn't move money, it's just the communication system. So very briefly, how does that turn into US power? As I mentioned, those CHIPS banks are all subject to US law. They're not all American banks, some are foreign banks, but they have operations in the US. So if the US government tells them they have to follow a rule or face penalty, they get in line and they follow those rules. And so the way sanctions typically work today, financial sanctions, is through the president issuing an executive order that directs the US Treasury, specifically OFAC at the Treasury, to add additional entities, individuals, government institutions to the specially designated nationals list, which Christine mentioned earlier. And it sort of effective immediately, that information goes out to all the banks, the CHIPS banks and all other banks operating in the US, that you can't do business with entities that are on that list. And these new ones are now added, they're off limits. And so effectively what happens is those banks, because of the threat of major financial penalties and even jail time for individuals who violate those, will sort of not answer the phone if that individual wants to now use the cross-border payment system. And so that's how that works. Asset freezes are essentially just preventing that foreign entity from being able to access their dollar wealth in the same way that we might seize a Russian yacht, right? Just sort of confiscating their wealth, in this case, financial assets.
Great. So that's a useful point to bring Mona in here, because when the sanctions were first rolled out in early 2022, one of the first things that sort of popped up on my radar was a concern that these sanctions would negatively impact the global South, right? Of course, global South countries are not strictly speaking on the SDN list. Global South entities, for the most part, aren't the new entries on the list. We're sanctioning Russian entities. And Dan was just talking about American banks and Russian entities. And so why are we concerned about the Global South at all in this context? How does this spillover effect sort of affect economies that are not involved in this conflict in any way?
Thanks, Ben, for the invitation. I think I'm going to start with your question about what's the South's position with regard to sanctions. And I think, and later I might address the larger macro financial environment in which these sanctions regime is being ratcheted up. But I do want to address, Dan, your point about correspondent banking networks, because we've seen in the Global South, affecting the Global South, the retrenchment in the correspondent banking system. So that has implications for financial inclusion and how countries like Iran, et cetera, are cut off from global financial networks via a sanctions regime that's actually become a technology used by advanced economies against the Global South. And so this has moved beyond a low-income country concern to a G77 plus China concern. I think the G77 are quite careful about how they're addressing sanctions per se. They're not always explicit, but it's implicit in their calling for a new global financial architecture, which gets us back to developmental aims that have really we've fallen short. If you think about the Human Development Index, we've been declining for the last 2 years. So terrible developmental outcomes post-COVID, and on top of that, a ratcheting up of the sanctions regime. Active sanctions right now are at a post-1950 peak. 27% of the world economy in terms of GDP has sanctions imposed on it. And we've seen a secular increase from administration to administration, Obama to Biden. We know that financial sanctions are watertight compared to trade sanctions. We can look at the attempt to have a Russian oil price cap and how that's being flouted in a way by Russia just increasing shipping costs on its oil shipments to India. They're charging higher shipping. But financial sanctions are more, cause more financial stress in these economies that we're talking about. The impact is not just relegated to the domestic country facing sanctions, but it kind of propagates outward. So within the country, you see capital flight, but you see disrupted cross-border trade. You see a reorganization of the domestic political economy with regional impacts, right, in terms of migration and other macro economic instability. You see that play out in Southern Asia right now, Afghanistan to Pakistan, in terms of the migration flows, Pakistan's inability to deal with them given its poly crisis. And you see that with regard to the Cuban 6-year-old embargo, but how that's led last year to the largest Cuban migration to the United States in half a century. I'll end there and I'll talk more about the macroeconomics later.
Great, thank you. So, Mona, one thing you mentioned, right, is that the financial sanctions are in a way watertight, they cause stress, and yet, we still have this debate about whether sanctions actually work, right? Are sanctions working? And in the context of the Russia sanctions question is whether they're working on Russia and what that even means. I had a conversation with a Russian lawyer not all that long ago where I asked how sanctions were affecting their life in Russia, and they said, well, we can't buy Parmesan, right? Like that was the main impact on their life, was that they could no longer get Parmesan cheese. There's really no functional substitute. But Christine, based on your research, this may be an unfair question. Would you say the sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine are working? And the reason that question is unfair is, what does it mean for sanctions to work? What is the goal here? What should we expect them to do? What can we reasonably expect them to do? And are they doing that?
And I think that's a fantastic question, because I think the idea of whether these sanctions are working, have they achieved their goals, really requires us to parse out what those different goals were and what the sanctioning nations can really realistically expect sanctions to achieve. Were they effective in halting the Russian invasion of Ukraine during 2022? No, but nor were they ever reasonably expected to be a substitute for direct military action. Right. So I think certainly the question is, are they perhaps reducing Russia's resources, ability to wage war, capacity to fund its war machine? And I think that also breaks down into short-term versus long-term effects. So one notable aspect of the sanctions were the sanctions against the Russian energy exports. And so in the short term, in 2022, the sanctions were not in fact effective in reducing Russian revenues in that area. Since the imposition of the oil cap, the price cap on Russia's exports of crude oil in December of 2022, there has been some progress in reducing Russian revenue. In the first half of 2023, revenues were down. There is a rally in the price of Russian crude, but there is some evidence that it was effective. The sanctions and the price cap were effective in that limited regard during that time period. The sanctions were also imposed against different targets for a number of different reasons and with different goals in mind as well. For example, there were the sanctions imposed against the oligarchs. And one goal of those sanctions was to increase the pressure on Putin from the Russian elite. Whether or not that is effective, it's not in the short term, perhaps in the long term, but that hasn't shown to be directly effective at this point in time. There have also been the sanctions on Russian financial institutions, and there are also export controls as well. So in addition to financial sanctions, there are controls on what can be exported from the sanctioning nations to Russia. And one of the goals of export controls is to avoid the direct supply of material to the Russian military. And there is some evidence that has been effective in reducing the Russian military supply of chips and so forth. But then we also run into the issue of import substitution from non-sanctioning nations, for example, Russia obtaining chips from other nations, or there's also the issue of transshipment. There's certainly evidence to show that exports through third-party countries, non-sanctioning nations, via originally from sanctioned nations, right? There's evidence that transshipment has increased significantly since the invasion. So export controls have had some effect, but certainly they're not 100% effective. So the answer is that it depends on what the particular goals are. It depends on whether you're talking about short or long term, and it depends on what particular sanctions or export controls you're looking at.
Great, thank you. So Nicholas, I'm thinking about your work here, and I'm being a little bit unfair because I sort of called this a book talk, but now I'm going to ask you about some of the pieces you've written following on to your book. You know, when in the early days of the 2022 invasion, there were a lot of, I would call them doomsday predictions about the sanctions, right? One of the doomsday predictions was that we could enter a sanctions-caused recession, right? We might see a global recession after Russia defaults on its sovereign debt, et cetera, that's caused by allied sanctions, right? Another doomsday prediction, sort of similar to what you read in your book from the early 20th century, was that the doomsday would occur inside Russia, right? There would be a real restriction of access to basic resources for ordinary people in the country. You know, in the past year, you've written about the Russia sanctions in Foreign Affairs and other outlets, and you know, have these doomsday predictions come to pass, and should we expect them to in the future if this conflict continues?
Yeah, I should probably confess that I think I was one of the people who used the phrase sanctions-induced recession on Twitter myself last year in a moment of panic. But what I think I underestimated is the reaction of policymakers and the fact that the world economy, like both the world economy as a whole and individual economies, have a lot of slack, have a lot of additional resources, have fungible resources. That's been very good for Europe when it comes to very quickly reducing its reliance on Russian energy. They've actually done that transition pretty quickly and effectively. The Biden administration had a big strategic petroleum reserve release. A number of other actions were undertaken. So at the global level, we managed to stave that off. And it was also in part a question of what oftentimes happens. The private sector first overreacts after heavy sanctions. And then it takes a while for everyone to figure out exactly what is legal and what isn't legal. But one of these overreactions was, for example, that no one wanted to go near Russian grain shipments anymore. And those are not under any sanctions for obvious reasons, that Russia is one of the largest grain exporters in the world. So we want those flows to keep operating. But it was actually something that had to be specified first. So that's one thing that our policymakers kind of sprung into action to make that clear. The flip side of that, of course, is that Russia too has these policymakers. They also are technocrats, and they've proven also to be pretty good at absorbing the blow. And to add to what Christine was saying earlier, I agree with her that it depends very much on the definition. And obviously, if we set more modest aims, then we can identify a number of successes. But I think the overall picture, the kind of big ambitions that some people formulated last year, so far the sanctions have proven pretty disappointing. And I've been a skeptic from the beginning, not really because I don't think that Russia has a lot of economic problems. They had economic problems already, but simply because of its size, this is a different scale economy than what we've tried to put sanctions on in the past. And I don't really think that there's something as too big to sanction, but I do think that there are economies in a certain category that Russia does belong to that are too big to sanction easily and effectively. And here, like Christine was also saying, the non-participation in Asia is really key. I think the last year has been particularly humbling for Western policymakers because we've talked a big game for many decades about the rise of Asia as a positive thing. And now it turns out that if India and China alone are not on board with your geopolitical objectives, they can more than compensate for all the loss of European and American and British demand for Russian exports. There's just, from the point of view of Russia's exports, not much of a problem with that. I do think in the long run, there are, like I said, problems for Russia. The most important one I would identify is labor and the labor supply. As they're going to mobilize more troops, and they have suffered a brain drain in a bunch of important sectors, particularly among highly educated workers, that will become an issue. I don't think that some of the arguments you see about them running out of money or having a kind of government finance crisis or public finance issues are that likely at all. I mean, the United States has 120% debt to GDP ratio. Russia is at 15, and they're running a 2% of GDP budget deficit. They could sustain that for many, many years. So I think if you take Bidenomics and its successes seriously, then it's also clear that Russia can, through emergency war, economic finance, sustain that for quite a long time. And I also think if you look at some of the people who made really serious predictions about Russian collapse, like the Yale report authors of last year, they went from saying Russia is on the brink of collapse to now saying, oh, could we please close this loophole here because we would like to increase pressure on Russia. So that's a noticeable, I think, moderation in their ambitions too. So I think that's where we are at the moment.
Great, thank you. So Mona, you planted the flag a moment ago that you were going to sort of zoom out and talk about the broader macroeconomic situation into which sanctions have been thrust, right? And in an essay earlier this year, which I commend to everybody for, Phenomenal World's Polycrisis series, you argued that the weaponization of the financial system is compounding the pre-existing economic vulnerability of low-income countries. And so in mid-2023, in terms of those compounded risks, what are they and how are sanctions contributing?
Right. So let's just talk about, what are these shocks? And there's a constellation of shocks that have hit the world economy, affecting countries, particularly in the periphery, much harder. And we're talking post the war in Ukraine, inflationary spike, interest rate hikes, and the appreciation of the dollar. And those have had really big consequences for developing economies that are commodity exporters and that they have pre-existing large external debt burdens. These are sovereigns that lack monetary and fiscal sovereignty, and they now have to cope with tighter budget constraints and greater macroeconomic volatility. And so the the sanctions against Russia spiked up energy in the world market, and it has prompted, as Nick mentioned, Russia is one of the gigantic grain producers, and so we have a food crisis, we have an energy crisis, and we have a money crisis. We haven't seen this particular configuration of different stresses. Things are really bad last year. Like 60% of low-income economies were in debt distress. And sort of there's a technical definition of that is when your sovereign bond yield exceeds 10 percentage points. Today, I just checked August 2023, not today, there were 15 countries that were experiencing debt distress, but that's still 15. And we're also talking about, larger economies such as Pakistan and Egypt that are now paying almost 50%. In the case of Pakistan, more than 50% of their public revenues towards debt servicing. So, what we're seeing is a very uneven response where there is this, massive liquidity provisioning at the apex of the global financial system. We have swap lines, right, for the G20 nations, not for all of them, but for most of them. And then you have budget constraints, austerity, imposed by the IMF in different programs right now that are really wreaking havoc on the developing world. I do want to talk about sanctions as another kind of vector of volatility, if you will, reordering national and regional political economies. And Asfandyar Batman-Hilij and Zeb Kalb have a wonderful analysis of this, rather short, but an interesting analysis of Iran, where there's been a doubling of value added since 2015, but a lowering of the wage share of income. So it's kind of interesting. The Iranian GDP is actually done just fine, but the gains have gone towards the Iranian elite. And I don't think that was, these are truly the unintended consequences of sanctions. And, there's also capital flight, which makes financing conditions much harder for these countries. And by the way, developing economies hold about 3/5 of the world's foreign exchange reserves that are the safety net for them, because they can't rely on swap lines, right? The repo lines that they have with the Fed, well, that's sort of on, the terms that they have with the United States, the geopolitical terms. But these, post the usurpation or freezing of the Russian 300 billion in foreign exchange in the central bank reserves, these economies and China are worried about what's going to happen to their dollar reserves. Altogether, emerging markets and developing economies hold about 7 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. And so that's a worrying factor.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I want to bring in one more perspective here on the consequences of sanctions, because another kind of fear that I heard emerge very early in the crisis of 2022 was about U.S. dollar dominance, right? So the United States is going to weaponize the dollar against Russia. Europe is joining, so countries can't flee to the euro. And so what's going to happen? Is it going to trigger a flight from the dollar? Is China going to set up a rival payments network that's going to, sort of deplete U.S. dollar dominance? Or maybe everyone's going to buy gold and Bitcoins, Dan. I don't know if that's the future. But what are we seeing happen? And as this goes on, does the threat to U.S. dollar dominance really materialize?
The dollar is doomed, Ben, completely doomed. Everybody sell your dollars. The first thing I think we're seeing is a rise in awareness, right, around the world about the political risk that is inherent in the dollar system. So the more that the United States has used the dollar as this coercive tool of foreign policy, like Mona was saying, right, starting really with the Obama administration and continuing to the present day, what that's done is sort of revealed the inherent political nature of the international dollar system and dollar assets. So access to the network and access to those dollars, the value of the network and the value of those dollar assets to any individual actor depends now, right, on their political relationship with the United States as much as their position in the world economy. And that's sort of a new development, that sort of awareness. And as that awareness of political risk grows around the world, I think what we're seeing And what I try to document in the book is a rise in what I call anti-dollar policies. These are designed to reduce an economy's dependence on the dollar as a cross-border settlement and investment currency. Now, not all of these policy efforts succeed. Many of them fail spectacularly. But in some cases, governments have been able to succeed in de-dollarizing certain segments of their international economic ties. And so, real quick as an aside, I do want to be clear that I don't view sanctions, to your big broad question, and this is the big debate, right? Is dollar dominance and threat? I don't view sanctions as the thing that are likely to cause the dollar to lose its sort of dominance. In fact, in recent months, what we've seen is the dollar's role as a cross-border payments currency has actually increased rather than decreased, according to SWIFT, just in aggregate. But I also would add that doesn't mean that this phenomenon of de-dollarization, which is a real thing, both in terms of interest and a real development in certain corners of the world economy, is not meaningful. I think it is meaningful. So my own view is we need to sort of separate conversations about dollar dominance from de-dollarization, which I largely view as a country level phenomenon, not a macro one. So I think, broadly, we'll continue to see what we've already seen over the last 10 years, a select group of countries trying to find ways to reduce their reliance on the dollar, diminish their exposure to US sanctions, and in some case, build alternative systems. Very briefly, you asked about China. Yes, China's already developing a rival payment network. It is much smaller than the CHIPS SWIFT dollar network. It's called CIPS, but it is growing. It's doubled in size in terms of usage over the last 2.5 years. There are banks in over 110 countries that are participants in this, including over 30 Russian banks, which are now part of this and using it as a way to evade US sanctions. So that's, I think, a real meaningful development. And some of that motivation comes from concerns about sanctions. And then you mentioned gold. Yeah, gold has had a revival of sort as a central bank asset. But there are limits to what you can do. You can't invest. You could, but you'd be kind of crazy to invest, the majority of your central bank assets in gold, because it's not as liquid. It has real limited usage. But the benefit is it can be held in physical form in your vaults, and it can't be frozen by the US Treasury. And so there has been a significant increase. 2022 is actually the largest year of purchases by central banks on history. And that's after almost now 10 years of net purchasing by central banks, after 20 years of central banks being net sellers. And that's concentrated, and I show this in the book, right, in countries that have been sanctioned or at high risk of being sanctioned by the United States.
Great. So I want to speak to the audience for a second. I have one more round of questions for the panelists. We're going to go till 3:00. And then, in the meantime, if you have questions, there's time for that. And you use the Q&A function that is down at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter your questions, type them in, and then I can sort of distribute them to the panelists as appropriate. And so I want to talk, Christine, you've already mentioned energy and the energy sanctions, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, especially for folks who may not have been as aware of the dynamics around energy, but energy was a particular challenge and a particular issue of concern, and continues to be around Russia. And part of that is because Russia is a major producer of oil and gas. But the problem is even knottier and more thorny than that, right? And so if you could kind of explain for our audience what the problems were with energy sanctions and sanctioning Russian energy interests after 2022.
Yeah, certainly. So one interesting aspect of the energy sanctions was that whereas most of the sanctions that were agreed upon by the coalition of nations were announced in conjunction with each other and were pretty rapidly decided upon, energy was more controversial. And that's because the different jurisdictions and nations were in fact differently situated with respect to their reliance on Russian oil and other energy supplies like LNG. And so whereas countries like Canada or Australia were able to more rapidly ban imports of Russian energy supplies, it took a bit longer for the US to do so, but the EU actually was quite dependent on Russian energy imports. And so that took several packages of sanctions, but in December of 2022, and then in 2023, the EU, a number of measures did become effective in the EU to ban imports of certain Russian energy supplies. And so announced in conjunction or with those measures was the oil cap, the price cap that we've referred to before in this conversation. And so that was agreed upon by the G7 nations to place a maximum price, a price cap on the price of Russian crude oil supplies and services by parties subject to the regulations of the G7 nations could be provided, but only if that oil was sold by Russian suppliers at or below that particular price cap set at $60 in December of 2022. So so energy sanctions are an interesting aspect of the sanctions because of the fundamental nature of oil and other energy supplies as fungible, and also because of the fact that once crude oil and other raw energy supplies are substantially transformed in another country, they're no longer considered to be, under the international trading system, products of Russian origin, right? So once crude oil is processed and transformed into a new product in a third country, it's no longer subject to the same import restrictions as Russian crude oil itself would be. So the fact is that energy also it's subject to this feature of the system where third party countries that are non-sanctioning nations can purchase Russian energy supplies and then be able to use those inputs in the sale of their own processed petroleum products. And so that's the energy sanctions aren't entirely effective, and it's by their very nature. They're never going to be effective in completely cutting off Russian revenues from energy supplies. And then there's also the same issues of transshipment and sanctions evasions that we see in other contexts as well. And it's particularly present with respect to oil, again, because of its fungible nature and its the fact that it is often difficult to trace the origin of any particular barrel of oil once if just by the nature of the product itself. So that's a brief overview of those sanctions around energy, but they're really, they pose particular problems for the sanctioning nations in terms of the effectiveness of those sanctions and in reducing Russian revenue.
Great, thank you. And so I want to bring Dan back in here too, because Dan, a lot of the examples in your book come from countries that are major oil and gas exporters. And there are some pretty obvious geopolitical reasons for this. But we're talking not just about Russia, but also about Venezuela, about Iran. And you've talked a little bit about de-dollarization strategies at the country level. And so I think this is an opportunity to kind of illustrate how that works, especially for a country that has this kind of portfolio of revenue, which is derived in some large percentage from fossil fuels.
Yeah, right. I think energy exporters are in a pretty enviable position compared to countries that don't export energy as far as sanctions targets go, because they're more difficult to fully isolate, right? And they can weather sanctions more effectively because their main exports, it's always in demand, right? They're always going to be markets willing to find ways to circumvent sanctions to get access to those resources, usually at a discount, so it can sort of work out to benefit both sides. We're seeing that today with countries like China, India, and Turkey, which have all increased their energy imports from Russia since the start of the war. And increasingly, based on reporting that we're seeing, those countries are paying for Russian energy in either yuan or rubles. So we're seeing, evidence here of de-dollarization in the energy sector, in pockets, right, of the energy sector as a result of sanctions. China's also, bought energy and oil from Iran and Venezuela as well at big discounts. So this has been going on for a while. So again, I think sanctioned energy producers are really better positioned to find partners that are willing to work out these non-dollar payment tools. It may be less efficient, but if it's the way you can get the trade done, you're going to do it. But beyond just the sanction states, I think an interesting development to watch in the de-dollarization in energy space is the fact that they tend to attract attention from countries that are worried about potential U.S. sanctions in the future. China's the big one here, right? China's been active of late working to craft closer ties to the Gulf states, especially the Saudis, but also Iran as well, which has been sort of developing that relationship for a while. China, of course, is a big importer of energy, and they're concerned about the potential future where the United States might sanction Chinese entities and cut them off from the dollar system. And since oil is traded in dollars, this would curtail theoretically access to energy imports, threaten the Chinese economy and its national defense. And so this is, I think one lens through which we can view Xi's recent visit to the GCC countries earlier this year. And one of the items on the agenda there was conversations about settling more of China's own oil trade in yuan. There's already a small share of it which is priced and settled in yuan, and China wants to see that grow. I don't think China's going to succeed in fully de-dollarizing its energy trade anytime soon, in part because I don't think the Gulf countries want to receive all payment in yuan, because there are limits to what you can do with that currency. But China is working to have that infrastructure in place, I think, in preparation for this future scenario where things go further south. So I would say, and for the energy exporters, it's in their own interest to play ball with China, at least somewhat on this, given that it is the world's top importer of oil and gas.
Great, thank you. So, but we shouldn't, if we're talking about energy, we shouldn't just talk about oil and gas. We should also talk about green energy and the green transition. And so, Mona, in your writing, you point out that the war has, on the one hand, accelerated the commitment, especially in Europe, to a green transition. European countries recognizing that they're too dependent on oil, and particularly Russian oil, and so the geopolitics and the green politics kind of align to try to push things towards green energy. But also, as Dan has just kind of suggested, that the war has actually been quite profitable for oil and gas producers. And so how do we make sense of this apparent contradiction, and what does it portend for the green transition in the future?
Yeah, I think we're in a moment of real, contradiction, and on so many fronts, and they have yet to be resolved in a Hegelian fashion. We're far from that. I think the war has been, as Dan said, it's been hugely profitable for oil and gas producers. Their incomes doubled compared to more than double compared to their 5-year average last year. Russia, as folks have mentioned, is a major oil and gas producer. It was producing 40% of Europe's gas, about a quarter of oil and gas globally. While Europe, that has been hardest hit in terms of oil and gas prices, has moved farther and further along on its green transition, it's also relying more and more on US energy imports. So about 40% of European LNG imports are coming in from the United States. It's a real stunning reversal, given that just a couple of years ago, Europe had decided that they don't want to engage with American LNG because it was very toxic, more toxic. Just the shipment of energy involves a lot of, it's very energy intensive. So it's, in terms of what happened in the LNG market, well, we're seeing, acute shortages in the rest of the world. 70% of US LNG is headed to Europe. So we're countries experiencing blackouts along with, debt distress. What is going to happen to their green transition programs? Well, they can't finance it. And the problem that we're confronting is that oil and gas profits in 2020 were enough. Were they to be completely taxed, they were enough to fund a decade of investment in low emission fuels. And that could actually get us to that global net zero emissions target. Of course, those profits haven't been taxed as they should be. So we're in a world of, hurrah to the hydrocarbon dollar. And what happens to the peripheral parts of the world economy? Can they go beyond being sources of extraction in terms of critical minerals? Or will they be caught up in that game, in the geopolitical game? And it's a real concern because, it comes down to where's the financing? And now I don't want to talk about the IMF, but there's not enough public financing. And that's really going to portend very badly for these countries' ability to go through their own energy transitions. The way that, the US hopefully will do, the IRA needs to be bigger than $8 $385 billion, which is the new climate spending program we have in the United States, it's not big enough. And who knows what's going to happen with a Trump administration, if that's going to be the world next year or so. So we're living in a moment of real flux. I don't know where things will go.
Right. So in the vein of speculating and thinking about an unknowable future, Nicholas, you wrote a piece late last year that was quite provocative, and I do think it's somewhat speculative in its spirit, where you suggested that the tools of economic sanctions and the lessons from the failures and partial successes of economic sanctions could be adapted to help actually further the green transition. And just sort of for the benefit of folks who maybe have not read this piece, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about what you had in mind and how this might work.
Sure, yeah, it was really meant in the spirit of thinking about possible worlds, which I know you've also written on in relation to international law. And one of the things that studying history, I think, does for me is that it shows that these tools have been yoked to very different norms over time. So we could, if green energy and the green transition are an advancing norm, then we should think about how we're going to put these tools in the service of enforcing those norms. I think what I was interested in is whether you could use sanctions to accelerate the green transition. And one of the promising avenues is obviously the bigger trend towards individual and entity and corporation level sanctions. So to get away from statewide sanctions, because of course emissions are not actually things that nations as a whole do, it's particular sectors, and within those sectors even particular firms oftentimes that are responsible. So if we take that very capillary approach to sanctions that OFAC, for example, has developed, and you think about what you could do once you have a serious commitment to getting towards, say, the Paris climate agreement goals of emissions reductions, that could be quite interesting. I think the issue with that is, one, that the American state, if it's going to use its significant sanctions power in the service of such a campaign and such a green transition, needs to develop more autonomy from the private sector, right? The US is incredibly good at putting sanctions on foreign banks, entities, and firms, but it has yet to really target a major American company that has significant political clout in the American political system. And I think that this also goes towards the autonomy of the US state from the private sector. So that seems to me the big challenge. There are other states in the world that have that autonomy to force their private sector to do stuff that they really don't want, but the US hasn't really shown that it can do it. So that would be one test that would have to pass first. So the other thing is, of course, that sanctions right now are beginning to interact with technology policy. And the chip export controls on China are one prominent example of that. Of course, we also need China, and China has a potentially important role in the world economy as a provider of a global public good, namely very cheap solar and wind energy. And now it seems like they might be in a position to start providing that. So I think that's an important balance to strike. And then finally, there is what the EU is doing, which is carbon border adjustments. So those are not really sanctions or even export controls. They're really tariffs, but it's a tariff to tax imports into your large economic zone based on the carbon intensity in the supply chain. And that forces your suppliers to start greening their entire production process. Potentially also a quite powerful tool, and it's much more in the realm of trade and industrial policy. I should say I'm a big fan and advocate of the recent move towards more industrial policy. I think the issue is that it's gone tied to a quite offensive use of economic coercion that really risks throwing out the baby with the bathwater by making this more interventionist set of policy tools something that mainly advance security competition. And in a boiling world, I don't think that we can afford that.
Completely agree. So I have a couple of questions in my queue, but we have time for at least a couple more. The first one is a legal question, so I'm going to direct it to Christine, who is our resident lawyer on the panel. And it's a question about the norm of non-intervention, sovereignty and non-intervention. And and the question is there a situation where unilateral sanctions may amount to prohibited intervention under international law? And I know that's a conversation that has been running for a few decades, but I'm wondering, in your research and your work on this, sort of where you've come out.
Yeah, so I thought Julia Schmidt's article from 2022 was really interesting on this topic. I can drop it here in the chat. It's about the legality of unilateral sanctions under international law. And she does make this argument that when unilateral sanctions go beyond merely countermeasures, they can be considered to violate this principle of non-intervention. So I will drop it here in the chat, and I definitely recommend checking it out. It is a very interesting article. And so I think that her discussion of how, in fact, this could be possible, and how there is this tension between the imposition of unilateral sanctions and non-intervention, right? I think it's fundamental to this question of unilateral sanctions.
Great, thank you. So we have another question here, which I would kind of throw up into the group, but Christine, you may have thoughts, and others may have thoughts as well. Is that we've been talking about what folks sometimes call unilateral sanctions, although really they're plurilateral or multilateral in their way, which are sanctions by individual countries or by small groups of like-minded countries. And we haven't talked about the United Nations at all, right, for a whole hour. And so the question is interested in folks' views on the relevance of UN sanctions, and refers to the recent episode of terminating sanctions concerning Mali, and whether there is any sort of role to play going forward for United Nations sanctions. Yeah, Christine, I'll hand it to you, and then if other folks.
Oh yeah, certainly. So the reason why sanctions from the United Nations voted on and imposed by the UN Security Council were not imposed against Russia, for example, following its 2022 invasion of Ukraine is because of the fact that Russia is able to veto those sanctions because of its position on the Security Council. And so I think that where we have a situation where Russia and the coalition of sanctioning nations have since 2022 become diametrically opposed, where we have this tension and this opposition. There is a debate, as you state, about the effectiveness of the UN Security Council as a mechanism for imposing sanctions. And so I do think that in this environment, we will see a move away from UN Security Council imposed sanctions and towards the plurilateral imposition of unilateral sanctions, as we've seen since 2022, because of this opposition of interest within the Security Council itself.
Great. So I want to riff on that, and that might give other people some purchase to come in, because I think each of you in your way have talked about multilateralism and the role of multilateralism going forward or looking backward, right? Nicholas, I know that from the historical work you've done, some of the visions for sanctions are quite different from the world order we have now. I've read stuff talking about an international parliament that would adopt a criminal code, the violation of which would lead to the imposition of sanctions only after a decision by some international court, which we obviously don't have today. But is there a more modest version of global cooperation that might be in the future? Dan, your book sort of ends with recommendations that are really targeted toward the Beltway in Washington, but do refer to multilateral cooperation and things are better when we work together kind of approaches, and so how confident are you that there will be uptake in Washington of a more multilateral approach? And Mona, for you, I one of the things that has really been coming on my radar, maybe a little bit late, because I'm an international economic lawyer, but so focused on trade and investment, is the role of the IMF, right? The role of the IMF in managing this kind of polycentric vulnerability that we're dealing with today, that sanctions are a part of, that the war is a part of driving. And so I know you said you didn't want to talk about the IMF, but maybe we should. Maybe we should talk about the IMF a little bit, and maybe it is the place where we should be looking for global governance and multilateral cooperation. So I don't know, Nicholas, I'll start with you and see if you have thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I'll just keep it real brief, I think. But this is a broader issue, I think, of what kind of international legal principles and norms you can make broadly acceptable. Certainly, the violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity would seem to be an important one, and I think that is the lowest bar, most widely acceptable reason for countries to condemn Russia and its invasion for Ukraine. But on the flip side of that, right, the UN not being a perfect agent for the enforcement of that norm due to the Security Council doesn't just have something to do with Russia being able to block it, right? If we think about Indonesia and East Timor, Turkey and Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, Morocco and the Western Sahara, there have been many cases of territorial violations where some member of the Security Council decided that it was not in an interest to enforce sanctions on that. Yet the US in 2003, it would be interesting to think what the rest of the world could have done, right? There wouldn't have been an equivalent option to seize US sovereign assets abroad because the US doesn't have it. But if you take that principle seriously, irrespective of whether Saddam Hussein is good or bad, that's a violation of territorial integrity. And so you need to have some kind of norm that you can universalize. I don't have any good answers to that, but I think that is still the norm that is most within reach for countries, and that could be more widely acceptable. Then I'll just leave it at that for now.
Dan?
So on the question about multilateralism and U.S. sanctions policy, first off, briefly, like, why is that important or why is that meaningful? I mean, on one hand, it's just more effective, right, when you're working with your allies. We've seen in the past, leading up to the war, before the actual invasion, where the Russians were moving more trade and more assets into the euro because it was viewed as a safer place and sort of a haven from those dollar sanctions. And so if you work together with your allies, you eliminate those alternative options. Another reason, and I think the more important reason why multilateralism is important, especially in big critical cases that have significant sort of secondary effects. You look at the 2018 decision by the Trump administration to pull out of the Iran deal and what that did with U.S. relations with Europe, and really led to a lot more of a sort of favoring of a more muscular Euro policy by people throughout the continent, who are saying this is ridiculous that the United States can sort of force European companies through, in this case, the use of secondary sanctions, which really sort of scale up the impact of U.S. sanctions. It's ridiculous that the United States can sort of force European companies to make these moves out of Iran or suffer significant penalties. That damage has been sort of slowly repaired somewhat, though I don't think that the wound's fully healed. I mean, Macron in April was still in China talking about strategic autonomy and so forth. So I think it still exists. And I think the elephant in the room as far as the future, am I confident there'll be uptake in Washington to calls to act more multilaterally? Or the elephant in the room is Trump, obviously. I mean, clearly a second Trump administration, I have no confidence would embrace a multilateral approach to sanctions or probably anything else. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Thank you, Mana.
So I think what's happened, very concretely, is the emergence of these two geopolitical blocs, right? Economic blocs, security blocs, energy blocs, and one of them is, say, NATO, or the group of 7 countries, the world's 7 largest, richest economies, and then the BRICS nations. Here, that's a treaty alliance that has recently expanded beyond Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It has new members starting 2024. And so what the plan for the BRICS new development bank is actually to very, I think they're kind of forthright about it, is to pose as an alternative to the International Monetary Fund, whose conditionalities imposed on economies to whom they lend in crisis, balance of payments crises, they are very onerous for these countries. So the IMF is in a very interesting place where it's providing more financing than ever before in a crisis-torn world economy. And at the same time, it's profiting from those crises. The single largest source of financing income, not financing, but for income for the IMF is actually surcharges. And so these are just onerous duties paid by countries if they borrow more than their I'm not going to get into the technicalities right now, but if they overborrow and if they borrow more and on a short-term basis, they have to pay more. So these are just unfair charges on economies. And so there's been a push to tell the IMF to reduce or get rid of its surcharges on low-income economies altogether. Countries in crises altogether, countries dealing with the poly crisis of, say, Pakistan, climate, as well as debt. The IMF is interesting. I was reading the US Treasury's speech, Jay Schomburg's speech yesterday, and I think they're hearing the voices from the global south that are calling for more quota reform as the nature of the global economy has shifted, where these BRICS economies are actually contributing more to global GDP than the largest G7 nations. So, along with that kind of gravitational shift in the center of the world economy is this call, a very correct call for more power, more voice in the global economy. I want to say, though, the BRICS is far from being an alternative to the IMF. 70% of BRICS financing is in dollars, 70. So it's aiming now to extend its share of local currency financing to 30%. So again, a moment of flux. I do think the IMF should reform. I do think it should expand its quotas and its which are the basis for votes at the IMF. And right now, in the speech from yesterday, it's really not going to do that. So there's this push to not increase quotas for particular partners like China and India, instead to just gradually increase quotas for every economy. So the countries, the big players, the middle income countries, China, also India, they're not going to get those votes at the IMF. And so they're backing off, they're moving away to Shanghai.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have one more question in the queue, and then we do have a little bit more time if anyone has an interest in entering another question. Use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. But I'm going to read this question because it's fact specific, but it's provocative. It's about the relationship between sanctions and industrial policy. So, for example, let's say the U.S. decides to use various sanctions, whether it's financial sanctions or export controls, on China's chip industry to preserve U.S. dominance. But according to recent news, China has developed some pretty sophisticated chips, which seem to be in contrast to that intention. And so how do you how do we evaluate the effectiveness of sanctions on the industrial development of sanctioned countries? And I think I would add to that, is the China example kind of unique in that respect, right? Is China able to sort of respond to sanctions in a different way from Russia or Iran or Venezuela? And what are the implications of that? But I'll sort of open the floor if anyone wants to jump in on that. Or I will call on people. I mean, Nicholas, Christine, I saw you take off your mic. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to point out that it's an interesting question. And I think it's interesting to think about the difference in this question when we think about export controls versus sanctions, right? Because I think that certainly they're two very different things and also have different short-term and long-term effects, right? I think certainly if we're talking about export controls and export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, certainly those will have a more of a robust short-term impact, whereas in the longer term industrial policy, right, when China will develop its own chip industry, right, when export controls are in place, because it understands the impact of those export controls at that point. And so I think it's interesting to think about the different time horizons, and also about whether we're talking about sanctions or export controls.
That's a good point. And I think, so Nick, I just want to bring you in here because, in your foreign affairs piece, I think it was, you referred to a success story that was touted by the U.S. Department of Commerce that in mid-2022, Russia was ripping chips out of washing machines to install in tanks, right, because of a chip shortage, right? And I'm sure that the industrial base of these two countries is probably not comparable, but is that success story all it's cracked up to be? Is this an instance where sanctions can actually cause some damage, or are we going to see the same dynamics over the medium to long term that the questioner sees in China?
Yeah, well, of course, they have different aims, right? Because with Russia, it was really about cutting off access to chips or reducing their imports of them as much as possible, as quickly as possible. With China, I think it's about preventing their ability to manufacture them at a level where they're competitive with Western chip technology. In Russia, it certainly seems to have caused a temporary chip famine in the late spring to summer of 22. But in the meantime, things have recovered. And now the data suggests that they've been able to not only restock, they had already built up stockpiles before they launched the invasion. They've restocked and they now have even more chips that they're importing than before the war. Russian imports across the board are actually at levels above that of, they're at levels higher than that of pre-invasion imports. So their adjustment kicks in, and you need to think about this in the long run. And again, we can react, but so can they. So the Chinese in Hong Kong, the role in that conduit is important. With China, I mean, I just think that ultimately most people who you talk to about the chip controls do admit that eventually they expect the Chinese to get this capacity. So the main gain seems to be that in the short run it gives the US an edge. There are some national security grounds, but it seems that the antagonism that this creates in China, where technological progress is seen as very important and key to the legitimacy and sense of national purpose now of the PRC. The increase in antagonism caused by these chip curbs, it seems to me, is something that might actually itself cancel that out. So to me, I don't really understand why the chip controls have been imposed, because I'm hearing a lot of different stories about it. And they, of course, there's what they do at the technical level, but they're filtered through a set of perceptions on the Chinese side. They already announced with Made in China 2025 back in 2015 that they wanted to become independent. In the first few years, that didn't amount to much, but now it's clearly one of their national missions to do it, and they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at it, and it seems to be having some success. And most people, I think, again, believe that they will eventually succeed. It's just a matter of how long. So what is the gain that is being obtained in terms of security, and particularly with an eye towards a potential crisis or issue over Taiwan emerging? What is the actual leverage that the US gives away also, right? Because once you have a Chinese high-tech industry that is no longer dependent on any Western suppliers, including on any European or Asian allied suppliers, you're in real trouble. It already also seems, for example, that the Chinese have managed to put a lot of their sovereign reserves in Hong Kong institutions where they are tied into the balance sheets of the intra-Asian financial market. So I don't think that a Russian-style asset freeze there would be possible. It would just be an immediate cardiac arrest for the Asian economy. So I think those are some real issues, and we'll see. We'll have to see. But I think so far, the jury's out.
So we have one more question now about, so we've been talking about this from the perspective of states, but the questioner wants to know about the impact of sanctions on individuals, right? What's the state of play? What are things like, whether we're talking about sanctions on Russian individuals, Iranian individuals, how do sanctions affect them? What does that look like? I mean, I think, our entities are at a wide level of familiarity with this. And so some folks may not know how that works and how that affects folks' lives. So I open that up as well. I mean, I can offer a little bit while folks are thinking. You know, sanctions can be quite devastating. I mean, I explained sanctions to my 6-year-old, and you know that you can't buy things, right? You know, that's the basic idea. And he said, oh, so they die, right? That's the and we know that there are ways to work around sanctions, but that's the basic effect, is that if you can't buy essential things, you're in trouble. And so so the way the U.S. sanctions regime works is that there are, you know, licenses, both general and specific, that allow folks to engage in transactions. But there's a lot of administrative slowness there, right? You know, there are cases where folks need licenses, specific licenses, to buy essential medications when they're under sanctions. And the process for getting those can go on longer than they might like, right? And so sanctions can be quite devastating at an individual level. With respect to the Russia sanctions, there's a conversation going on right now about whether all these assets of Russian oligarchs or supporters of the Putin regime that are frozen can be seized by the United States and then transferred, perhaps to the victims of human rights violations or of the aggression in Ukraine or elsewhere. And so, Christine, I don't know if you touch on that in your book, the problem of transferring frozen assets, but if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, certainly. And I'll also touch on the first part of your answer as well. I think the sanctions, right, a feature of sanctions is this idea of over-compliance, the idea that regulated entities have a tendency to over-comply, to observe legal restrictions more than they have to avoid legal risk. And so where things like humanitarian transactions are legal under sanctions regimes, parties perhaps will, in the US or other sanctioning nations, will stop doing business with a country or region or parties entirely. And so certainly in Iran, that's had humanitarian effects, right? Quite tragic ones. Iraq is the classic example of the devastating humanitarian effects that can occur. There is an article on overcompliance. I think I see the author in the audience, so I'll post that as well. It's very good. So overcompliance is a feature of sanctions. On the asset seizure versus merely freezing assets of sanctioned individuals, yes, that certainly has been an ongoing debate after the imposition of sanctions. Most sanctioning nations at this point, the enforcement authorities do seem to consider that there aren't currently legal authorities for asset seizure, the taking of those assets and redistribution to Ukraine to help pay for reconstruction. Canada recently passed a measure, and they're seeking the seizure of assets from a particular oligarch. So that will be interesting to watch. That's a novel legislative authority that was developed in response to the invasion and the seeking of new authority to actually affect asset seizure.
Wonderful. Well, I see no further questions, and we're a little bit under time, but I wanted to take a little bit of time to thank everybody, thank our panelists, thank James Steiner and the folks at ASIL for their help getting this set up, and my colleagues on the interest group, Joanna, Juliana, Maria, for helping us set up this event. I think this has been a fun conversation. I hope folks learned a lot. And I do want to put in a word to our members. If you have ideas for programming, if this kind of thing is something that works for you, if there are particular topics that you'd like to hear more on, if you'd like to hear more about economic sanctions, then that would be interesting. Send me an email or send an email to any or all of the leadership and let us know. We'd be happy to do more events like this, within our personal within the limits of our resources and capacities. But I think that this has been great. I want to thank the panelists for a really wonderful discussion. And thank you guys all for joining us on a Friday. And I hope you have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Yes, there will be a recording on YouTube. We'll send out the link.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Bye.